What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
This is San Francisco.
Welcome back to San Francisco. In November, we put out an episode on censorship on college campuses, particularly the UCs around Palestine, with Luby Kutami and Dylan Rodriguez. And today, the episode's about media censorship with Tiana Reid, a professor at York University who works on Black lit, gender, and labor, and has worked at The Nation, New York Times, Paris Review, and works with one of my unions, the Freelance Solidarity Project at the National Writers Union specifically. And we talk about how objectivity is, of course, dictated by elites, and also how as of March, there are 95 media workers and journalists dead in Gaza since last October, and how journalists outside of Gaza haven't shown them the same sort of solidarity that journalists typically give other journalists, as well as how everyone that we know is practicing news avoidance in 2024. If you like the show, please go to patreon.com/SadFrancisco to find our previous episodes, including the one that I mentioned with Dylan Rodriguez and Luby Kutami. And you can also throw us some cash there as well. Super appreciate everyone that is making it possible for myself and Tofu, our producer, to bring you the show on a fairly regular basis. And Tiana is after the break. Hi, Tiana. Thanks for being on San Francisco. And I wanted to start out with asking how you got into journalism and labor work around journalism.
Thanks for having me. So all of these definitions are so tenuous. I'm also a literature professor, so that will come across a little bit, but I'm not really a journalist. I consider myself a writer, and some writers consider themselves journalists and whatnot. Also an academic and an academic writer. And I think a good chunk of members have these kinds of overlaps, whether they're book critics or film critics or investigative journalists. So I could give you the long story or the short story. The long story begins with my mother, who was a public school teacher during the Mike Harris era in Toronto, Canada. And so I spent my time as a little girl on the picket line with her when the teachers would be on strike, her union, the elementary teachers of Toronto. So that's sort of planted the seed. All I remember is like eating lots of pizza and screaming and yelling, but I think that was enough for me to plant a seed. And then I went to graduate school, and I was writing a lot while in school for various publications. So I was sort of freelancing and writing. And at school, we unionized our graduate workers. So I was a rank and file member of the Student Workers of Columbia, the UAW Local 2710. And this was like a decade ago, before we were recognized by the NLRB into our first strike and beyond. And so that's when I kind of really got my own taste of labor. And then overlapping with that was when in 2019, I was invited to go to an all-day strategy session at the Writers Guild of America. And that was what is now known as the Freelance Solidarity Project. They became part of the National Writers Union not long after that, but that was like, 5 years ago is when I started organizing with FSP and Freelance Solidarity Project and NWU, the National Writers Union. And, and all the while I have an academic, sounds weird when I say it like that, but I have an interest in labor and theories around labor and Black women's labor that I kind of study in a more academic setting. So it's all over.
Right on. Yeah, I am myself a member of the Freelance Solidarity Project, National Writers Union, and I appreciate that the union has been really front and center with recent organizing around Palestine. I know that you all have been really paying attention to what is going on here. I know there's like a report we'll link to once it's out about some of the retaliation that members of the union have expressed that they've had related to their work and the topic of Palestine. And like going back even to the basics, can you talk about like what is the National Writers Union, first of all?
Yeah. So the National Writers Union is a union that represents writers of all kinds in all formats, whether books, journalism, essays. The FSP is housed within the digital media division of NWU. So FSP works on improving the working conditions and really the lives of freelance digital media workers. So that can mean writers, journalists, but that can also mean people who work in radio or podcasting or even like communications, for example. So yeah, and I think that we're seeing a bunch of layoffs and discrimination and this reliance on advertising and venture capital. And so NWU and FSP is just a kind of space where we try to address the conditions of being alienated from our labor, and we try to build a community to fight against that isolation. And I think it's interesting, like organizing freelance workers is a challenge because we're not at the same workplace. And because the conditions of our work are often more precarious, they're not as consistent. And so collective bargaining, which is something we think of when we think of unions, can be a bigger challenge. So it's an interesting place to organize for sure.
Right. Small number of really wealthy people have the power to decide we don't want to publish anything around certain topics. And that's absolutely what we have seen around Palestine since before October 7th. And I was wondering, could you speak generally to how some journalists have experienced retaliation from outlets and editors around Palestine here in the US?
Yeah. So, you mentioned the report that a bunch of union members have been working on, and that hopefully will be out soon. But that report draws on various sources from news reports, social media posts, messages like emails with the folks who were affected, and also 2 surveys that the National Writers Union put out about asking workers to share their experiences of workplace retaliation. And then also a second one about how they have themselves self-censored. So maybe not said certain things because of the threat of retaliation. And so the way that report is thinking about retaliation is like when an organization or an outlet or an editor, when something that they do negatively affects that media worker in response to something that they did in terms of like showcasing the Palestinian perspective, drawing attention to the genocide, expressing solidarity with Palestinians. And so that ranges from people who were fired, staffers who were fired, pressures to resign, termination of long-term contracts, and then, of course, like canceling assignments, which is more something that freelance workers might experience. So that's the kind of varied things that journalists in the US have been experiencing, just like a few things. And I think one thing important to note is that I think what the report showed was like the people who are impacted are often people of color. And that's something that speaks to like how US newsrooms weaponize diversity and inclusion in a way that's sort of superficial and fake. And I think also with these kinds of reports, we also have to remember like what's happening that people aren't talking about or aren't reporting, and those are things that we hear through whispering networks or signal messages. And some things don't come to the surface of our view right now and may not for a long time. And I think like the impact that we're going to see in like journalism is really, really widespread and broad.
Yeah.
And some of this connects to some of your other questions, but
yeah, no, I think what you started out with, like, so important, like the idea that not only are people self-censoring because they kind of have an expectation that, well, if I want to bring a story to a certain editor at a publication that has traditionally, not run a lot of content with Palestinian voices, I'm just going to like keep it moving. Like, next topic. I've certainly been in a situation twice with a couple of publications. One was The Nation, one was Color Lines, where I got kill fees, did receive a fee, an agreed upon fee to produce the story, and then the story wasn't run. And in one case, I was able to take it to another publication, but still like kind of puts a wrench in things in that like the timeline gets screwed up. Then you have to shop the story around to some other publication and hope that someone else will pick it up, which doesn't always happen. So you have stories that just never run because of censorship. Some of these outlets in traditional media are having to come to terms with diversity and equity initiatives and incorporating some people into their folds. But are those people going to be like bootlickers and sort of like, are they going to bring up issues that ostensibly like would be of importance to people of color? Also wondering this unspoken rule in journalism that I don't even know where I picked it up, but I can remember as long as I've written for the past 20 years or so, is that journalists kind of have each other's backs in a way. And from your perspective, just wondering, are Palestinian journalists being treated differently from what you're seeing?
I mean, I don't know if this is kind of where you're getting, but there is this sort of even internationalist solidarity between journalists that I think we often see. And NWU, is the sister union of the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate and has been for a while. And there's obviously, you mentioned this before, like we're seeing deadly violence, we're seeing the targeting of journalists in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Israel, in Lebanon. And I think, CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, put out a report recently. And I think they said in 2023, 75% of the journalists killed in the whole world, they died during Israel's assault on Gaza. So absolutely, Palestinian journalists don't count as a kind of like protected class. They are the exception of what we think of, journalists needing safety and protection. And Monday was organized by the IFJ, which is the International Federation of Journalists, and FAJ, the Federation of Arab Journalists. It was the International Day in support of Palestinian journalists, and they reported that 100 journalists have been killed in 4 months. And so obviously, too, is that there's many more who are missing or wounded or without homes or without family because they have been killed. And then in addition to that, we have the destruction of media outlets and like offices, publishing houses. So we see this like attack on people, but also on ideas and on thought and on Palestinian knowledge and truth. And this is kind of part of the larger global landscape of how the Israeli state is attempting to erase the existence of Palestinian people. And that this is like a war of information, which is why I think all journalists and writers need to be paying attention to this, because like the very things that we say matter, like truth and objectivity, which, I think is bullshit to begin with. But like,
Agreed.
But like those things are being put on the line here. And we see that this is really like a war around knowledge and words and information.
Yeah.
And the manufacturing of consent and all of the sort of like propaganda for the Israeli state that we see in the New York Times, all the time, in Wall Street Journal, whatnot.
For sure. Yeah. And I mean, even if, the few outlets that are left in the US that will send journalists overseas, that number has shrunk a lot over the last 20 years. Certainly, there's no publication that I can think of in the Bay Area that's sending people over to Gaza right now. But even if they did have the means to do that, Israel requires all international journalists covering the war to be accompanied by Israeli military escorts. And then the military gets to review any footage or, writing before broadcast, or else that publication faces like being banned from reporting in so-called Israel. So kind of like a big picture question that I had, and something that I've had to think about a lot as somebody who has written and done journalism for 20 years, always had like another job. Pretty much the only publication that I was able to piece together a living off of writing for them was when Al Jazeera America existed for a few sweet years and had the oil money from Qatar to fund journalism out here. And so they were able to pay, what certainly would have been like a living wage for me at the time. But they closed up shop. I think it was like 2016 in the US. So since then, I've always had, piece together work, and freelance journalism has been something that I've done that's subsidized by something else. And like we've talked about, traditional outlets are like bleeding people, and like along the same timeline, fewer people are getting news from traditional outlets, corporate media, and more people say that they actively practice news avoidance. And anytime they get like the scent of that something's going to be presented to them as news, they run the other way. How do you think the past 4 months of coverage around Gaza affects trust in traditional media, and in particular corporate media?
Yeah, I actually hadn't heard about this term news avoidance, but obviously when you said it, I was like, I know exactly what that means. And I probably also do it several times throughout the day. I think that on the one hand, I want to say curtain is pulled back, gloves are off, like to use all these metaphors and be like, everything is rising to the surface. But at the same time, the genocide drags on. There are multiple genocides that are not reported on.
Absolutely.
And so I don't want to like oversell the lack of trust in corporate media and traditional journalistic outlets, but I think it is clear, and if, I used to live in New York, and I'm a member of the Writers Against the War on Gaza, and they've been doing like a lot of direct action targeting the New York Times. There's a lot of skilled things on social media about the manufacturing of consent for genocide, misinformation about the UNRWA, for example, or sexual violence, or how like racists always have op-eds. Like a lot of this is too like not super new. And so I think it is revealing what Palestinians have known for a long time, or, for example, what Black people have known for a long time about the New York Times, right? The New York Times, who said that Michael Brown was, quote unquote, no angel. And so I hope that objectivity itself can be questioned in such a way, because who can afford to be objective? Who is granted the access to this mantle of objectivity, right? It's only this straight white male who can be objective, right? No one else can, because we're too queer, we're too Black, or whatever it is. And you mentioned this, the sort of DEI push that I think is really coming. I think there's a little bit of struggle happening like within a workplace, within newsrooms, that we might not know right now because it's kind of a little bit unseen, but that journalists are told to bring their perspectives, but like only a little bit, or only when it's useful. And then objectivity gets weaponized, right? And it gets used just for the ends of the status quo and imperialism. Right. So yeah, I kind of went off a little bit on a tangent, but I hope that we can focus on and fund and make and create all different forms of media and writing that will kind of dismantle and abolish corporate media as we know it.
Yeah, down. One question I had for you is, where do you get your news?
I mean, this is part of the problem because I get my news, from Twitter, from Elon Musk.
Same.
Yep. And also people sending me things, Signal or whatnot. But I think there's a really big problem when we think about it.
For sure.
And just the ads on Twitter, the way fascism and fascists run rampant, the way, everything, we know everything that sucks about it. And so...
Yeah, I just read that, the word decolonization has been banned. And we don't know all of the different ways that the algorithm's working. Probably no one does, even at Twitter. No singular person knows, but certainly we're getting a very, very skewed, narrow sense of what's going on out there.
Exactly. And it sucks because that's where we go. That's where a lot of journalists go. And when we think about, I once was in an organizing meeting and I don't know if someone said it, and it was social media is basically the writer's shop floor. It's our equivalent of a shop floor, but it's a very flawed and shitty shop floor because we don't have any control or relationship to it. I don't know what my career, quote unquote, would be like without social media. Even just my making community on social media, organizing on social media. I think so many of us rely on it for our lives. And so I don't want to downplay its importance or its historical importance to us and to movement and to organizing.
Thank you so much for taking time out to speak with me. Before I let you go, wondering if you wouldn't mind name dropping a few of the current Palestine-related projects that you've heard NWU members are working on?
Yeah, for sure. So, I will say we had a panel early January, a Know Your Rights Journalists and Free Speech at Work panel that was about individually and collectively responding in the face of retaliation and censorship. And there should be some resources around that to share. We've also just been trying to make connections across the labor movement. So if anyone's listening and wants to reach out, we would appreciate that. We did a teach-in with Labor for Palestine. There's going to be a labor contingent at the March 2nd March in New York. And then, of course, we do weekly digests that are trying to mobilize our members on various solidarity things, phone banks, direct action, etc. But I would say the big thing is the report that will be coming out that hopefully I'll have a link for you soon. A lot of members have been working really hard on that, and it's just been amazing to watch.
Definitely interested in checking out that report. I'm expecting to get a little affirmation that some of these gaslighty things that have been happening to me as a freelancer are actually happening. And last, if people want to find or follow you on the internet, is there a place that they can go?
Yeah, best place is probably my Twitter at Tiana Reid, TianaReid. And then I also have a website, tianareid.com.
Sweet. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco, which is produced by Toshio Moronic and edited by Tofu Estolas. If you have it, please throw us a few dollars through patreon.com/sadfrancisco, which will help us pay for podcast hosting, editing, and transcriptions for the show. See you next time in Sad Francisco.